Filmed on location at our beautiful Old Westbury 604-acre campus, we offer a variety of majors to choose from and a wonderful opportunity to discover the leader in you. Please visit us at oldwestbury.edu. When can you start?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another program in our series, Living on Long Island. Today we will focus on the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, the only president with Long Island roots. Even though he was president over 100 years ago, the qualities that made him a special man and president are still used today. And I wish some of his qualities could carry over into today, and we'll see why that is so important. I am privileged to have three guests who are presidential historians in effect and know a great deal about our country's history. They are Dr. Anthony Haynor, Associate Professor of Sociology at Seton University. Before anybody asks, yes, he is my brother. Number two, Mr. Henry Boitel, attorney and president of the Rockville Senate Democratic Club. Henry, welcome. Thank you. And Dr. Howard Ehrlich, professor of history and education at St.John University and a former executive director of the Theodore Roosevelt Association. Did I get all of that?
You got it right.
Welcome, sir. Sure. You have a special connection to Theodore Roosevelt. And just briefly, what is that?
Well, several things. My major interest is as executive director of the Theodore Roosevelt Association, which is the only association, presidential association, sanctioned by Congress. It was in 1919 on his death. And so we, the association, try to spread the word of TR, the bully pulpit, if you will. TR was such a wonderful man, not just president, but a wonderful man and a family man. We have great connections with Sagamore Hill, and I work with Sagamore Hill as well, getting people out to the house and the estate.
Tell the Long Islanders who are interested, where exactly is Sagamore Hill? What is it? What is the status now, and what is being done there?
Sagamore Hill is a National Historic Site. It is located in Oyster Bay Cove. The construction, which is, by the way, ongoing, about $7.2 million appropriated by Congress. The house is closed, but the museum is open. What is being done is a complete renovation of the house.
And when will the house be finished?
2015.
And the public can view it?
Exactly. And we're going to have a grand opening. Hopefully dignitaries will be there, maybe the President of the United States, who knows?
Would that be nice?
That would be very nice. So we hope that it will be open in 2015.
And it will be open to the public?
It will.
Okay. But the museum you said now is...
The museum is open. They have wonderful exhibits down there. 3 rooms, one in the pre-presidential years, the presidential years, and the post-presidential years. There's some wonderful artifacts there. I mean, if we had some time, I could spend 3 hours just taking you through that museum. It's just a wonderful museum.
Henry, what are the influences of TR on Long Island today? Either things named for him or where he was, or what are some of the...
I think Howard would probably be better at telling us who, what on Long Island is named after Teddy Roosevelt, but I can, in terms of influences, it would be great if we could copy Theodore Roosevelt here in Long Island in terms of his dedication to reform. I mean, this is the great reform president. So Howard, perhaps you can tell us about all the places that are named after Teddy.
Well,
briefly, Howard, go over a couple of...
Okay, well, there's so many. Of course, the town of Roosevelt, Long Island, is named after it. By the way, you mentioned Teddy. I have to set the record straight here. He hated the term Teddy. Theodore, T.D. was his nickname when he was young. His wife would call him Theodore when she's particularly angry at him, you know. But there were many, many places along Island, including on the South Shore in Sayville. There's a house where he actually rode his horse all the way down there and back to his cousin's house. Montauk Point, by the way, there is a huge park there where the Rough Riders were there before, and they actually came back from Cuba. So you actually, there's a sign there, by the way, historic sign there as well. There are many, many others, but just suffice to say. Now, In New York City, of course, we have the birthplace as well, also run by the National Historic Site, by the Park Service as well.
One of my favorite programs on TV is Blue Bloods. I actually watched that. And the picture in the police commissioner's office is Theodore Roosevelt. Now, what's the significance of that? He was police commissioner?
He was, actually. He was, you mentioned the word reform.
Yes.
Henry said. He definitely reformed the police department. He did everything from starting the beginnings of the police academy to having, he actually went undercover, by the way, to see if they were not drinking and sleeping on duty and so forth and so on.
He used to walk the beat, as I understand.
He did.
Yes.
He did, exactly.
But Henry, you mentioned, and Tony, maybe you could come in on this, reform. Why is that so important today, or why was it important then? What was going on in the early 1900s that reform was needed? And how did he lead that fight?
Well, he led the fight in several different areas. And so he's a great trust buster, for example, a person who brought about legislative reform to bring the trusts under control so that these big monopolies did not have the kind of power that they had over the people, and that so that and in many areas, whether it be issues that are presently pending today, things that are prominent in the public debate now, were prominent then too. Unfortunately, we haven't, since Teddy Roosevelt, had somebody quite like him to bring about that vast array of reforms with a great deal of courage and a great deal of knowledge. He was a reformer with his feet on the ground, is the way I would describe him. And his entire life was like a series of operas, you know. I mean, the grand events. I mean, he made a grand event out of everything, but he did so generally in ways that were meaningful. That's my impression.
Right.
I know you have some info to show us, but before that, Tony, Mount Rushmore, South Dakota, 4 presidents: Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt. Why is Theodore Roosevelt up there when you're talking about the greats of the great?
Well, one of the things I know for a fact is that he, for example, had the major idea for establishing national parks, right? And that idea, I think, really bore fruit in a fuller sense after he left the presidency. But he was very, when you say environmentally conscious, that was one of the things that stood out about him.
He did.
Right.
He also, the bully pulpit, I think, is important here. First president really to use.
Explain to the audience, what does that mean, actually?
Well, you think of the pulpit and the church and so forth and so on, using it to the congregation, the minister getting up there. He used the office of president, okay, to expire to the people what the president needs to do. For example, settling a coal strike that affected the people. Using the power of the president for people's good. I think you mentioned the word reform. I think that we're here. By the way, if I may,
yeah, please.
Doris Kearns Goodwin book recently on Taft and Theodore Roosevelt, the bully pulpit, is right there. How he used the office of president, and then, of course his relationship with Taft. You mentioned that Doris Kearns Goodwin was a resident of Long Island.
Rockville Center,
Rockville
yes,
Center.
our hometown, yes.
You guys are from Rockville.
Yeah.
Right.
Put a plug in for her, good.
I certainly will. Marvelous book, by the way, and if everybody's looking, you're reading a great book, this is one to get it. But yes, it's using the office, the power of the president for the benefit of the people.
But we're now, again, this is 100 years ago, but let me see if I can make a connection. Today we commonly see politicians making a show of these things, making a show, well, I'm doing this, I'm doing this. You're saying for him it was more than a show, he actually accomplished these things.
Yes.
He was a solutions person.
Yes.
He had the courage to devise solutions and promote them, and in many respects get them passed and implemented. And were it not for solutions that he put into effect today, one wonders where we would be today. So he had courage, and he had a sense of reform and a sense of history and a sense of what the needs of the country were.
And he's associated with the so-called progressive movement, right? And what are some of the roots of that movement?
Well, let me just get back to the point you mentioned about the Food and Drug Administration is a perfect example of that. Looking at the books, the muckrakers, if you will, The Jungle being one, Upton Sinclair, seeing the horrendous conditions in the meatpacking plants, and he said we need legislation in this area, and hence the Food and Drug Act was passed. Is that one thing? Reform was his key. I mean, the trust busting, going after monopolies, price fixing. To name just a few. He really was concerned. And in his later life, after presidents, even he was firmly for women's voting rights. Matter of fact, it's one of the last things he wanted to get passed. So you see that trend there. Now, the progressive movement, of course, starts Lafayette, Wisconsin, and so forth. In 1912, he ran on the Progressive Party ticket as a third-party candidate against his good friend Taft. But he tried to bring those views up. He thought Taft was too conservative, and therefore he wanted to run against him in that way. He was kind of disappointed.
He was unique in ways, but every president was unique. But how unique was he? What things did he do, or what things did he say, or how was he raised that made him unique? In other words, what I'm trying to say, he seemed to be a split personality. You had mentioned he was very brave and he did courageous things, yet he was, health-wise, he was sickly in many ways.
As a child, he suffered seriously from asthma and respiratory condition. It turns out that he had a number of physical ailments over his life, some of which were like asthma, but some of which were injuries that he sustained.
And he died a fairly young man.
He did, but he was shot. He was a victim of an attempted assassination. Interesting story there. I think you can tell it better than I can, Howard. Why don't you tell it?
Okay, he's in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. This is 1912, and what happens is he's in a motor car outside a hotel, and he's going to give a speech in the hotel, and he's sitting next to his cousin Philip, and all of a sudden a man comes up with him with a handgun and fires point blank into his chest. The first thing that happens is that he takes a deep breath to see if any blood is coming from his lung, and it's not. His cousin Philip says, "Are you okay?" He says yes. Now, what saved his life was the eyeglass case and very thick speech he had. By the way, if you're interested in looking at that, we have that in the birthplace in New York City. So what happens is he goes into the hotel, but right before that he says, "Bring that man to me." And the Secret Service bring the man to him, and he says, "Okay, take him away, don't harm him." He goes into the hotel, a little balcony overlooking these 1,000 people waiting for him. They had no idea what happened outside, and he gets up there and he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, I know you do not know this, but I've just been shot." And they were going, "What are you talking about?" And at that point, he says, "But it takes more than a bullet to kill a bull moose." And this is the kind of man he was. He wouldn't let that stop him.
And he gave a speech.
And he's a man who actually gave a speech with hundreds of people without any microphone.
In fact, when president, he lost the vision in one eye. I don't think most people were aware of that, but he went through the rest of his life climbing mountains and not changing his lifestyle at all in terms of being a rough and ready person going out there into the wilderness and into places that most people wouldn't go, exploring Africa, doing all kinds of things. And yet here's this man with leg injuries, respiratory problems, one eye, and he never used it as an excuse.
We like to do ifs of history. If this didn't happen, if that didn't happen, it's an exercise for historians, and it's good conversation. He became president because William McKinley was killed, correct? Right. If McKinley didn't die or wasn't killed, would Roosevelt eventually have run for president anyway?
Well, in my opinion, I don't think he would have. He might have, but we don't know. As vice president, he hated the job, by the way. He was forced out.
Join the club, right?
Yeah. He hated the vice presidency. He thought it was a know-nothing job. But I think that he might have entered a primary, maybe against McKinley, possibly.
Remember, he was only 42 years old, so he's not like some of the old days. The vice presidents were much older. He was still a young man.
Right. So it was really, as governor of the state, he elevated to vice president. Whether he would have run for president, we don't know.
And how about the people around him? Does that book mention it, or do you know of any? Tony, you're really interested in people around a president, a cabinet, and things like that. Who were the people around Roosevelt?
Did he have a brain trust? So to
Did
speak,
people?
or-
Did he listen to them, or is he so overpowering that he dwarfed the others?
Yeah, he actually formulated a lot of his own policies. I don't think he depended too much upon other people. His family was very important to him. His sons were particularly.
He had 5 children?
He had, and as a matter of fact, he was married twice. His first wife died very early on. He remarried Edith Corot. They had another 5 children. He had 3 boys, 2 girls. What's interesting is that 4 children. It's interesting that of all the children, the one he thought would be the one that would go on after him was Theodore Jr. And Quentin. Now, Quentin was the one that really hurt him the most because he died early on.
And that's who Roosevelt Field's named for.
Correct.
Okay.
And I should just mention that as a former site, another site.
Yes.
Yes, Quentin died very early in 1918 as a pilot in Normandy, France. His son, T.R. Jr., went on to become a great general during World War II and D-Day. Got the Medal of Honor, as T.R. did, by the way, posthumously. Father-son combination. I was mentioning to Henry, do you know the other one he did? MacArthur.
MacArthur, yeah.
Father-son, correct.
Wow.
So the family was a key part to his support here. Now his cousin Franklin, he admired, and mutual relationship there. It's interesting to note that when Theodore Roosevelt died, they asked Franklin, who was over in Versailles with President Wilson, any comment, and he said yes, he was the greatest man he ever knew.
Okay. All right.
Interesting, something interesting should be noted about Theodore Roosevelt. He was the 5th cousin, I think it was 5th cousin of FDR, and he was the uncle of Eleanor Roosevelt,
The future First Lady.
the future First Lady, and actually raised her and was guardian of her for some period of her youth up, and gave her away, I believe, in the to Franklin when they got married.
Right. This is actually a copy of the marriage certificate that Theodore Roosevelt signed with Edith. It's Franklin Eleanor.
And what year was that?
This is 1905.
1905.
Now, what happened is that he gave her away at the wedding, as you mentioned, Henry, in a house in Manhattan. And you had the Hyde Park roses on one side of the study and the Oyster roses on the other. And here is the minister performing the marriage ceremony, and he says, I think I'm the only non-Roosevelt here. So there was a connection there too. And if you look at FDR's program, the New Deal, and Henry mentioned this before in our discussion before the program, that indeed you see the roots of Theodore Roosevelt's program in FDR.
Did he come back?
And in Eleanor, who then became a person dedicated to human rights. And
Absolutely.
where did she get a lot of that from? No doubt from her upbringing by Teddy Roosevelt.
No question.
Would you know when he was president, did he come back here often to Long Island?
He did. He came back to vote in all key elections. There are pictures. We have photographs of him lining up with people, saying hello, a little campaigning. He'd come back to Oyster Bay as much as possible. He'd spend the summer, extended summer months here in Oyster Bay because Washington was so hot. He enjoyed Oyster Bay. He had guests come up all the time to visit, including his good friend John L. Sullivan, the heavyweight champion of the world, visit him as well. Yes, this was the Mecca, the summer White House, if you will.
And was it not the site of a diplomatic initiative as well?
Correct. The Treaty of Portsmouth, which ended the Russo-Japanese War, signed in 1905, which he was the first American president to receive the Nobel Peace Prize as well. Exactly. Started there, finalized in New Hampshire on a ship.
And the only one to get both the Nobel Peace Prize and the Congressional Medal of Honor.
Correct.
But now Roosevelt was a complicated man too. Many times his policies contradicted. Wasn't he known as a militaristic, pro-military, pro-American president and prior as president, Spanish-American War, and then he wins the Nobel Peace Prize. So how was that consistent, or that's what it is?
Well, I would say, saying here that he did think that foreign policy was important. He made America the world power it is today. The Great White Fleet was sent around the world as a sign of the power of the United States. The building of the Panama Canal was important here. I think just touching the, some of the major items here, there's so much more we could say. But yes, he was a president who wanted to be involved in world politics. He felt very strongly about it. He actually had his own Monroe Doctrine, if you will, of this hemisphere. And of course, his military background, the Rough Riders, getting involved with that as well, became a hero, coming back a hero, which precipitated his nomination for governor of the state of New York.
Let's look at today briefly. How would those qualities, why would they be necessary today? In other words, if he were president today, again, an if in history, of course, but how could he help solve some of these problems today?
Without jumping into that immediately, I'd like to make a suggestion. If one went to Amazon or Barnes and Nobles online, typed in Theodore Roosevelt, you would see this huge number of books. And they fall into two categories. One is books about him, and the second is books written by him. This was a man who, as I said before, had solutions in mind. He was obsessed with coming up with solutions to problems, and he didn't have the slightest hesitation about putting a solution on the table so that others could rip it apart or do whatever they wanted to do, but he had the guts. Okay? The question is whether present politicians really have the guts, whether present politicians have the depth. I mean, here's a guy who wrote, I don't know, I didn't count the number of books he wrote, but he wrote everything from about the Boy Scouts to about the history of the country to about conservation, and he filled out books, and these were not books that were ghostwritten, like many books today by politicians are ghostwritten. This guy wrote his own stuff. So if you want to get a sense of the difference between him and what we have today, all you have to do is take a look at, and the covers of those books are great. You have these covers which tend to be designed according to what it is. I'm talking about the books about him, what it is that book is focusing on, whether it be this book or many others. And they show this vast array of activities that the man engaged in wholeheartedly, without hesitation, and ready to put himself on the line at a moment's notice. It was the same thing he did with Cuba. Whether you agree or disagree with what our role was in ousting the Spanish from Cuba, the fact is, he not only as a I guess it was Undersecretary of the Navy or whatever it was, helped to set that whole thing up, but he immediately resigned and formed a commission, a troop. What do they call it? The Rough Riders, and went down there and was right in the thick of the battle.
Correct. It's interesting to note, depending on what Henry mentioned here, with that, he is Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he sends Admiral Dewey to the Philippines, actually to Hong Kong, to go to the Philippines if war breaks out. Now he said, how can Assistant Secretary of the Navy do that? Well, the Secretary of the Navy is always sick. So he became like de facto Secretary of the Navy. He saw his chance. Well, because of doing that, we were able to help free the Philippine government from the Spanish domination.
How would he have handled the two main bugaboos of current presidents, Congress and the press?
The press stood outside the White House. It could be raining out, whatever it was. They were outside. He is the one that instituted the press room in the White House, where the press could congregate whenever they wanted to be there. And then,
but he didn't have a press secretary. He was his own press secretary in the film.
Well, I don't know if he actually had a liaison to the press, but he certainly was the person who orchestrated it.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, in Oyster Bay, those who want to go to Oyster Bay, you'll see a building called the Moore House. Upstairs was his office, and that was the liaison was there. So if you wanted to visit the president, and all releases came out of there, particularly. Most people realize that, yes, he was very outspoken. He said what he wanted to say. There was no prepping him for a press conference, if you will, if that's what you're asking. He invited political leaders to the House whenever he could. He spoke to them individually. So yes, he was, I guess, one of the first presidents to really use the press to his advantage.
And the Congress was in Republican hands, right? Both houses, so that certainly helped.
And Henry
him
Cabot Lodge
that
was his good friend. Speaker Joseph Cannon, sure.
By the way, and was he not responsible for the building of the West Wing?
Yeah, as mentioned that.
Thing,
He
right,
built the entire West Wing to the White House, well, yes, which we have today. And it happened to be in 2001, or 2000, yeah, was at the 100th anniversary of that, anniversary of the West Wing, and met President George Bush and so forth. It was very, very nice, and they had a massive celebration in the West Wing. Gave us a little tour.
So some former presidents are not thought of very highly. As history has made it a longer time since his presidency, he seems to have even gained more stature. He seems to be noted, as Mount Rushmore shows you and others, he seems to be noted as one of the great presidents.
On the other hand, if he were living today, I don't think that there would be much room for him in the Republican Party of today. Notwithstanding the greatness that everybody attributes to him, he would be, I guess, to the left in many ways, or maybe even to the objective more than to an extreme of one end or the other. But I guess that depends upon who's looking as to where the extremes are.
What would he do? I mean, if he absolutely, you said he felt absolutely that his ideas were right, and if they didn't go along with it, what did he do then? What could he do now?
Well, the bully pulpit concept implies that you go above sort of factional interests and take your case to the country at large, and so. But
I could see him being on television every other week, and really selling what he had to do. And he was.
He would use the full powers of the presidency in order to attempt to achieve his objectives, and one of his objectives certainly would have been to restore order to our democracy, something which has been missing now for a number of years, and which. Recent presidents have not done a very good job of being able to accomplish.
We only have a couple of minutes left. I just want to finish up on one thing, and then I want you to give a telephone number to Sagamore Hill before we leave, okay? So if the audience wants a visit, they can. His later years, he was served through presidency, just finished this up, he served and then ran again later, trying to get his old job back.
He felt at that time basically 2 terms was enough for him, and his hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft, was ready and waiting, and he turned the throne over to him.
If he had known how he was,
that would have been a different story, okay. Right? And of course, the next 4 years he had a falling out with him, and a good way to sort of round this thing up in the book, and one of the last pages in Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, he meets TR. They had a falling out. He meets Taft in the Blackstone Hotel in Chicago, and it's quite an extensive meeting. And they go in and he taps him on the shoulder, and Taft's there and puts his hands on his shoulders, and good to see you. And people in the dining room see this, they gave him a standing ovation, at least the 2 of them, which I think is nice. And sort of ending up, I think, very quickly at the funeral of TR in Oyster Bay, which is not too far from the house. He was one of the last people to leave the site of the Taft was. Yeah. And he's seen crying by reporters, said he was crying.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to this program. It was my privilege to have my 3 guests, Dr. Haynor, Mr. Boitel, and Dr. Ehrlich, who enlightened us with their wisdom and knowledge. I want to thank our special crew, especially Sherry Baker, who runs the studio so professionally, and David White, who did an excellent job on camera.
The phone number of Sagamore Hills?
Yeah, quick.
516-922-4788.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody, and until next time, have a good evening and a better tomorrow.